archaeology not just existing in these like really cool, faraway Indiana Jones exotic places, but they also occur in office spaces, in places kind of underneath universities or in libraries, and that's really where we start to look at the patterns that emerge from material culture and can say something about the community that uses it. It's also important to realize that archaeology isn't just prehistory. It's not just these people who existed thousands of years ago. There are also any material objects, as legally defined, that are 50 years old or older. So a lot of you might actually have things that if we found them in a context where we were doing a survey through the woods or a survey through the desert, where we'd have to go, hey, this is an archaeological site, which is really great and also a little bit hilarious because you'll be doing a survey in somewhere like the woods and you come across someone's kind of like drinking spot and go, oh, well, this is a full bottle, it's got a maker's mark that dates to 1960, this is an archaeological site. And we treat those a little bit differently, but it's important to think about archaeology as a science that can be done in any time. It's not just kind of far-flung and divorced from us. It can be even part of our lives. And so, moving on from that definition of archaeology, B is for beliefs. So after that definition of archaeology as the use of material culture to understand the human past, how are beliefs involved? Well, I think it's very important to understand that science doesn't exist outside of culture, although it is as I'm going to very clearly read, the intellectual and practical activity encompassing the systematic study of the structure and behavior of the physical and natural world through observation and experiment. That doesn't mean that beliefs don't factor in. One of my favorite examples of thinking about how science can be impacted by our beliefs is thinking about the comparison between a geocentric, an Earth-centric, and a heliocentric, a sun-centric conception of the solar system. So when we were first kind of developing scientific techniques, based on the knowledge that people had, they were primarily taking their understandings from the Bible, which was their general source of knowledge and general source of beliefs. So when they were constructing scientific questions, they were using that body of knowledge to ask their questions. So they were saying things like, well, the Bible says this, let's see if we can observe this. And so they started testing it. And some people found observations to support it, some people didn't. And after more and more information was collected, a lot of struggle and a lot of debate, this idea finally changed. But it's a great example of understanding how beliefs can impact the questions we ask when it comes to applying scientific methods. And so how does this apply in archaeology? Well, initially, it was believed in archaeology that individual pottery or projectile points could be kind of used to summarize the ideas about a group of people. For example, here in the Southwest, we talk a lot about the Mogollon, the Hohokam, the ancestral Puebloan. And although these areas have kind of evolved to have a lot more validity now, in some places around the world, people refer to exclusively by their pottery types, like linear band ceramics, so people that made the linear band pots. But that doesn't really say much about the community you're actually talking about. An example that I like to use is, for example, probably a lot of you have iPhones right now, right? Or a number of you, or smartphones of some sort. And if we were to look around everywhere around the world that people have iPhones, we can say that they had some shared conceptions about what iPhones are, a dislike of the most current update, or the design, or some error that everyone shares, but we can't say that all iPhone users are the same. And so it's really important that archaeology kind of made that leap away from necessarily saying each individual artifact type was a completely different culture, and kind of think about how that impacts what we're saying about the archaeological record. Another big impact as far as beliefs were concerned is that, and particularly for how we understand the archaeology of childhood, is to remember that historically, and in some ways currently, archaeology has been really dominated by, and maybe not always percentage-wise, but oftentimes power-wise, by able-bodied adult males. And even imagery that's common to archaeology, for example, the National Park Service emblem. This is an artifact type that is oftentimes, but not exclusively, associated with able-bodied adult males. And the problem with that is that if we, as a discipline, as a scientific group, are claiming to investigate all peoples in the past, but are using just the practices of adult males to say something about culture, we're actually not saying anything about the entire community. We're really only talking exclusively about one gender and one age group. And it's when we start to recognize the idea that we can't say that the experiences of just able-bodied adult males can be generalized for the entirety of the culture, that we're able to actually get at everybody. And if we kind of just focus on, stone tools and projectile points, we're only talking about the small group here, and we're ignoring everybody else. And that's really a problem. And once archaeologists were able to get over that idea and they started expanding their theoretical kind of background, we really were able to actually talk about everyone in the archaeological record. And that's once we can actually start to talk about children. And that made us examine what our assumptive beliefs were and how those impacted the questions we were asking about the archaeological record. And once we kind of got over that, we were actually able to think about the concept of childhood and children in the archaeological record. So this is who we're going to be focusing on today. I mean, not just this one guy, but how we get at archaeology, how we get at children in the archaeological record. So who are children? So there are lots of different ways that we can define children. There's the biological, which people who are familiar with losing the teeth, having children lose teeth, and leaving money for the tooth fairy might be very familiar with. There are changes in biology and development that we look at. Such as the fusing of your bones at certain ages, the eruption of and development of certain teeth. And they're a great way to define children, but if you think about culturally, that's not really how we define kids. When your kid loses their first teeth, you don't go, oh, well, you are now a 4-year-old. That's not exactly really how we assess childhood. One of the ways that's much more common and what we do legally here in the United States is based on chronology. So generally, we think about it as the time since birth. Time since birth is not always necessarily the event people measure from. In some cultures, when you are born, you are considered 1 year old. And so it's important to think about the different cultural ways in which event you're actually using. But for example, in the US, when you are 18 years old on the day that you were born, like 18 years since the date you were born, not the hour, you have transitioned from a childhood to an adulthood legally. But generally, as archaeologists, what we're trying to get at actually is a third way, and that is social age. And what is encompassing that is the idea of culturally constructed norms of appropriate behavior and the status of individuals within a particular age category. And I like to think of that as, kind of here in the US, a really similar thing that we can think about is getting your driver's license. So once you are able to pass with more or less success your driver's ed test, you have the ability to kind of move throughout the space without the restrictions or the necessities of adult transport or adult chauffeurship in some cases. And so you've kind of transitioned to that next step of adulthood. And also kind of more cultural understandings. We think of things like the bar and the mitzvah, as well as in Catholic communities, confirmation, this kind of social transition from adulthood to childhood, which might happen at different chronological ages and at different stages of biological development. So while those are some ways of defining children and narrowing on what specific age group or childhood category we're looking at, we need to be able to find connections between the material remains that we find and actual behaviors. And one of the strongest ways that archaeologists do this, and particularly because in the United States, archaeology is under the heading of anthropology, we draw a lot from anthropologists or sociocultural anthropologists' ethnographic work. And one of the most famous and earliest, though now highly contested, works that kind of looked at childhood or the transition from childhood to adulthood is Margaret Mead's Coming of Age in Samoa. And this really opened up anthropology because anthropology, like archaeology, had a similar sort of able-bodied male-centric questioning sphere. It really opened up the idea that all peoples are worthy of anthropological study. And so it opened up anthropologists to the idea of studying things like child-rearing practices, looking at the ways that children might have added stress to the adults in their lives, the ways that children participated in building or helping things or left things around. And it means it kind of changed our questions a little bit. But in many ways, a lot of the questions that were asked by early anthropologists didn't necessarily center children as actual actors in their lives, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But kind of modern studies now have really started to look at children in their own cultures as children as active agents in creating their own culture. So, kind of from that, as introduced to us, there are a variety of questions that archaeologists can begin to ask about the archaeological record in order to investigate children. The main ones are, who are children in the past? What is the difference between children, the actual humans that we're looking at, and childhood, the social practice of being a child? What are the material evidence that we can use to examine children in the past? What did children actually do in the past? Is childhood universal? Is childhood as a social construct universal? And when do we start to see kind of children in the past? And G is for generalizations. So while generalizations are great for making assumptions about people in your everyday lives, they are important for us to understand what we're looking at in order to find a theory that explains the material culture we find. It also gives us a common ground that we can agree upon when we're talking about who children are and what and when childhood actually is. And based on kind of cross-cultural ethnographic work, we are kind of basically stuck with this kind of very, very basic understanding that childhood is generally a unique time of human life associated with its earliest years. And this is a generalization that has existed cross-culturally, but it is cross-culturally as far as the modern period is concerned. And it gives us a feel for what modern childhood is like, but it's also important to look at childhood historically, what we can get from documents, because people change. As much as we think of ourselves as very traditional, when you start to look at documents historically, you realize that our traditions change quite rapidly. And additionally, because we're part of an increasingly globalized society, a lot of places have started to take on Western conceptions and Western cultural traits, for example, defining childhood. So it's not uncommon for people who come from different immigrant groups to say things like, I didn't have a childhood. And they'll say things like that because they're comparing their experiences to what the United States cultural definition is of childhood, and not view their experiences as different, but actually as a non-existent childhood. And historically, when we actually start to look at the historical record, early archaeologists who were interested in childhood actually got a little bit nervous because, we're looking at children in the past tense, childhood that was, and documents can tell us a lot, but the earliest historical investigations of childhood actually seem to support this idea that childhood didn't exist in the past. And really interestingly, historians actually didn't start to look at childhood until the 1960s either. And so it's not necessarily been studied for hundreds of years. But this conception, this idea that childhood didn't exist, was primarily based on the work of Philippe Evis, who was a French historian who looked at medieval artwork. He suggested that the nuclear family bonds of love and concern for children didn't exist because children died too regularly for parents to want to invest in them. And he also used a lot of evidence based on artwork. So for example, if we zoom into the baby Jesus, who's sitting there on the lap of the Madonna, he looks a lot more like a miniaturized, balding adult male than he does an actual baby. And that's fine, everyone has their own style. But it really kind of drawing from this evidence that children weren't conceived of as something different. They were just these miniaturized versions of adults. He used this to argue that childhood didn't exist. The problem with this interpretation, and that many historians since Evis has published his work, was that Evis was defining childhood based on the 1960s definition of childhood. Rather than looking at childhood as something that could be expressed differently, taking this generalization that it's whatever happens in the earliest time of a human's life, he was comparing it to our modern expectations for what children are supposed to do and how we see what children are supposed to be. Historians have also disproved this idea that care didn't exist in the past either. There's actually a lot of evidence to suggest that medieval parents cared very deeply for their children. And so this brings us to the idea of this transition in conceptualizing childhood to make us think about what are we assuming about childhood. Because we can look at childhood, including all of those assumptions. We can test whether modern childhood, according to our definitions, existed in the past. But it's not really getting at the kind of internal cultural childhood that most archaeologists are interested in getting at. And so it makes us think about that idea of earlier beliefs and how earlier beliefs are impacting our questions about anthropology and about the archaeological record. So for example, are we assuming that play is the main point of children's lives? And also by looking a little bit more in a little bit more detail at ethnography, we could kind of start to see holes in our assumptions about childhood, particularly when we conceived of it in relation to a kind of United States or a Western-centric conception of childhood. So kind of from these ideas and recognizing our assumptions and expectations, we kind of transition from this idea of a childhood or the childhood to many childhoods, a plurality. And we began to look at the many ways that children start to internalize behaviors and expectations that are associated with being part of a society, socialization, or being part of a culture, enculturation. And the idea of using socialization as a way to get at the behaviors of children in the past has really come kind of back again into practice because of the work of Allison James, who is here to remind us that children are kind of constantly learning. They're constantly learning from other humans, from objects, from the physical world that they inhabit. And I think one of the most important things that, that Allison James raised was that children also learn from other children. So if we think about the concept of peer pressure, that is a great example of how children interact with one another and can use their personal power to force or impact other children's particular behaviors, to incite a particular behavior or incite a particular action. So it's important to remember not just adults and particularly not just parents are involved in the socialization process when it comes to raising children. And so K is for kindling. One of the common ways once we start to think about how kids are socialized is that children learn a lot through not just direct teaching, like me standing here in front of you lecturing out and telling you what you should know, but through work, actually. And it's much more common here for kids to work in other cultures. And so this is an example of children collecting kindling. And cross-culturally and actually ethnographically, ethnohistorically, we have a lot of evidence for children participating in economic systems, doing this kind of low-level, low-responsibility, but very integral work in many societies, and particularly in the modern era, non-industrialized economies still rely a lot on children to do this sort of labor. For example, firewood is very important for cooking and making pottery, so it's really not like a useless endeavor, because it frees adults to do other more important tasks. And while in the United States we have labor laws that prevent children from taking on economically meaningful, aka paid work, before a certain age, that wasn't always true. This is a little bit more of a staged or stock photo of children at work in a garden, but it's really great to remember that children were important economically in households in the United States 100 years ago. And so it's important that when we start to look archaeologically at things like factories, we need to actually think about children as active workers in those systems. That there were particular tasks that might have only been done by children because they had the hands or the flexibility to actually be working those machines. And so it's really important to think about children as constantly integrated into the prehistoric and historic economic and community systems that we are investigating. And so L is for learning. But of course, all of those kind of low-level responsibility tasks, people don't get stuck carrying kindling for the rest of their lives, generally. And so this kind of this introduction to particular fields is allowing children to develop more complex tasks, and so that they can have the skills needed to be kind of masters of their culture. And one of the first ways that archaeologists of childhood wanted to get at kids was, of course, by looking at toys, which we have some, very, some examples of here. And toys are really great because they can be identified in the archaeological record, particularly in the historical archaeological record, when you can open up things like old Sears and Roebuck catalogs, identify a particular toy that was made in a particular year, and then actually find it in things like a museum context, or an excavation site, or if you're just digging up in your garden, you can find particular, like a little armament and date them to a particular time. And what was great about looking for learning and looking for toys in the archaeological record meant that we could go into existing collections or when we find new materials, particularly miniatures, and talk about learning in the past. And this meant particularly initially looking for things like miniatures, miniature pots, miniature weapons, miniature shoes, and these objects are all things that are proportional to children and point them towards responsibilities that they'll have as adults. And so, for example, if you are at an archaeological site or you're looking at an archaeological collection, that has a lot of dolls. You can talk about how it's associating generally young women to care for babies in a certain period, allowing them to practice behaviors for mothering. And that's a very common thing to look at as far as historical archaeology is concerned. But prehistorically, we can look at things like miniature weapons and look at the sorts of skills that young boys or young hunters in the community would have been expected to have. And so it's a really great way to examine what's going on as far as the material objects that are specifically being designed for kids and using that material culture to reinforce social interactions and particular beliefs about children and what children should be practicing or doing in their lives. However, work like looking at socialization and looking at children's work and even looking at toys to investigate children in the archaeological record is really great, but in many ways those questions actually center adults and adult perceptions, the way that children are helping adults, and the ways that adults think that childhood should be experienced. And while it is true that we are socialized in our childhood to eventually, or most of us, or whether or not we choose to be, we are being socialized for adult society. Children utilize objects in many cases differently than adults do. They conceive of things differently. I think a great example is from The Little Prince. I think on one of the first few pages, and he's showing a drawing to this adult, and the adult is like, "That's a hat," and the kid is like, "No, this is not a hat. This is a snake with an elephant in it." And I think that it's very important to realize that the children can have unique anthropologies. They can have unique cultures that are specific to their time periods. And I think that and that they can be a lot more active when it comes to creating the archaeological record. Additionally, this was a really important thing that we wanted to move past when we started looking at human remains, because many of the initial ways that we defined human remains was calling children sub or young adults, and there was always this comparison that necessarily the adult was the end goal. And evolutionarily, that makes sense. But the problem with that, when we think about that a little bit more culturally, is that it's expected that a person will reach adulthood, and that adulthood is necessarily your goal. And in most societies, while that is kind of generally the case, that's not necessarily what kids want to do. That's not necessarily how kids view their lives. And also, because of kind of childhood mortality and that sort of thing, we are kind of outnumbered in the archaeological record. If you think about every human that has ever lived, more people have ever been children than have ever reached adulthood. So there are actually a lot more probable expressions of childhood than there are in adulthood. And so this brings us to slightly different questions of the archaeological record, and then allows us to reevaluate some of our initial investigations, talking about questions such as how are we actually centering, how do we actually get to center children in the archaeological record as a specific subject that is not just in comparison to adult ideas. Looking also at children as integral to their own childhoods, that they are, they're actually the ones living that childhood. What did they think about it when they were actually living it and using particular material culture? Not examining artifacts as from the child's perspective and not just from the adult's perspective. And also bringing in this idea that I think a lot of archaeologists initially forgot, but that children have agency. Children make choices, children are active members of our society. And so it's important to think about archaeology in that context, that we're not just thinking about kind of sculptures of people that existed in the past, but people who chose to do things in their lives and made yes or no choices and that sort of thing as really subjects, not objects of study. I also wanted to preface before I go into the next slide. The next slide is a slide on osteology, and it does have a different version of the tooth eruption image that I showed previously, and one photo of an adult of the femora from one adult, and it is a human remains from Europe. So O is for osteology, and so osteology, which few of you in this room are actually experts on, but is the study of the structure and function of the skeleton and bony structures. And it's a really powerful way for us to investigate the individual, because certain bones and certain activities that we take on impact how things develop. And it's also very important for looking at the biological development of children. So earlier I talked a little bit about tooth eruptions and development, and so this is really important for us to define what age an individual was when they died, or at least what developmental age they were. As you can see here, it says 4 years plus or minus 12 months, so they could be between 3 and 5 years old. So it's important to keep that variation in mind when you start to talk about what the expression of a particular childhood was like. But also things like getting hurt, breaking bones. Osteology is really great because, in contrast to other sorts of methods, I think about it as kind of flipping the script when it comes to investigating children in the archaeological record. Because rather than looking at children to reference adults, you can look at an adult's remains and say things a little bit about their childhood. Particularly, for example, teeth develop at a particular age, and things like an increased amount of stress. If you go through a lot of sickness or that sort of thing, when your teeth enamel are developing, they can develop lines, as well as if you have particular types of sickness, they can leave evidence on your bones from healing and that sort of thing. And this image is of the priests I keep mentioning, are one image of human remains. And the author suggested that this kind of significant difference in the way that the bottom of your leg bone developed was indicative of an injury that the person suffered before they reached maturity. And so it's a really great example of showing how the activities that happen when we're young impact our adult expression in our bones. And while this is an example from Europe, actions, for example, here in the Southwest, such as grinding corn, which involve you being stuck in a particular position for a really long time, can cause different muscles to develop much more prominently and can impact how your bones underneath develop. So another really great way that we've been able to look at and center children in the archaeological record has been looking at pottery. And pottery is really great because it exists in a lot of different community contexts, but there's a lot of detail that goes into learning to make pots, particularly not just kind of forming them, being able to make the shapes, but also things like decoration. And what's really great is that the ability to create and execute particular designs can really only happen after certain sort of developmental periods. And this was kind of work that was pioneered by Dr. Patricia Brown at the University of New Mexico, who's my advisor, a very nice lady. And so she kind of combined psychological examinations of motor skill and kind of drawing development in order to construct an ability to differentiate adult-executed designs on pottery from child-executed designs on pottery. She also looked at forming techniques and size and a lot of other attributes, but I'm going to focus primarily on painting because it's a much more kind of visual, it's so much easier to see visually in images. And so both of these pots, if you look down here, are Mimbres black on white. But if you look at the designs, generally when we think of Mimbres pottery, we think a lot about like very finely executed lines, very even, very regular, very geometric, and that's not this. That's not this. And so she looked at how, at certain ages, people develop the psychological capability to do things such as execute parallel lines, or what sort of motor skills actually are required to do things like hold a pencil, or in this case, hold these pretty well-formed walls and fingerprint bridge breadth. So our fingerprints are made from rises and valleys, and changes in the friction of our skin. But looking at the average breadth between each ridge, and relating that back to age. And what was really interesting about this is that when she applied it to a collection of figurines and vessels from the Sinagua area, she saw that there was a pretty significant difference between the average ridge breadth found on burned figurines versus those found on burned vessels. And so she interpreted this to say that children were, primary makers of figurines. And what's really great about that is it kind of demonstrates how children are kind of learning the material that they'll be using, but creating their own objects. They're creating their own figurines that might really not have had too much importance as far as adults were concerned, but were really important for the development of children's motor skills, and for familiarity with a material that they would probably have to use regularly in their lives. I also want to point out that while both of these articles looked at both of these people looked at ceramics, neither one just said, oh, it's small, it's definitely kids. And I think that that's one really important thing that archaeologists have started to get past. Just because an object is small doesn't mean it's necessarily children creating it or necessarily children using it. And so I think that it's been really great to see these sorts of completely developed methods that really focus on children doing and children acting, and also as children as creators of the archaeological record, and saying something about what they were doing as part of a community, and not just saying it's small, it must have been kids existed, that's it. So Cubist Reporters, and so a lot of work, particularly in historical archaeology, has started to look at the ways that spatial distribution of objects that are related to kids can say something about their behaviors. And particularly when we start to see differences in the sorts of things that are found in areas that are generally associated with kind of adult supervision. So this is an image of a farmhouse. So cesspits that are here, closer to the building or closer to where adults are working, have a tendency to have different sorts of material culture associated with them than artifacts that are found farther away. And what's really interesting about this is that it starts to get at how children are actually being perceived, how children realize they're being perceived by others. So it demonstrates an interest by children of having privacy, wanting to have time away from adults, having time to develop their own personalities and ideas of self, practice particular activities, or perhaps participate in activities that adults wouldn't approve of. And it's really important to think about how children might conceive of space differently as well. One of my first kind of forays into thinking about what I could do as far as studying children in the archaeological record was to just think about some of the really great archaeological sites that we have excavated now, like Pueblo Bonito, and think about just what it was like to be like 2 feet tall and run and be in that area, and think about how that would completely change your perception of that landscape. And so it's really important to think about not only the artifacts that kids are leaving, but just how they might have thought about the physical world a little bit differently. And so R is for rebellion. So rebellion is very common in childhood. Everybody, at least at one point in their lives, goes through a rebellious period. And I think it's a really important way to look at children's agency when it comes to the archaeological record, because it's really where we start to get at this negotiation between what adults say that children are supposed to be doing and what children say they want to be doing. And as I have here, I think I have actively acting against and by crushing objects crushing objects. And so there are multiple examples in the historical archaeological record of it's a trash mound that's related to one particular house. And you will have, over the span of maybe a year, 4 or 5 different smashed porcelain dolls. And based on the census record, they can identify particularly which household was living there, the age of the individuals who were part of it, and they know that there was one young girl who recently had a baby brother come into play at that house, and that girl was not happy about that. And she was expressing that dissatisfaction with her place in that family by smashing these dolls that her parents continued to give her. And I think the most modern analogy that we can think of is whenever someone talks about either their own childhood or maybe their daughters, or if they allowed their sons to play with dolls, the idea of ripping their heads off the Barbie. In the sense of a Barbie doll, not like off of a barbecue. But there's this interaction between adults kind of trying to input particular ideas on children, and children saying, hey, yeah, that's not really what I want to do with this object, or that's not really the path that I want to take as far as interacting with this thing. And while we can't necessarily say that that young girl was saying, I don't want to be a mother, or I don't like babies, they were expressing some sort of